Hello everybody, the game that we have today is really interesting. It features a fascinating endgame. There's a lot of nuances. I find it super instructive, so I am excited to share it with you. This is game 8 from Bobby Fischer's 60 Memorable Games. Playing white is Bobby Fischer, with the black pieces is Paul Keres. Let's jump straight in. As I mentioned, the endgame that this position will reach I find really interesting. I think there's a lot to discuss there, a lot to learn from it. So let's go ahead and look at it. Now, the opening was really standard. We had the Roy Lopez, the A6 Berlin hybrid, where black is going to expand on the queen side while maintaining a strong and solid position on the king side with quick development. This is usually a very effective and very reputable defense that black can play. And indeed, black manages to find themselves in a pretty decent position from the opening. We follow some very standard mainline theory. White is developing, the knight is coming to f1 and e3 or g3. If you'd like, you can certainly investigate these positions on your own, but these are really well-known positions, so I'm not going to spend too much time looking over the opening here. I want to get to the interesting endgame. So we have knight e3 here, black goes rook to e8, the knight hops into f5, both players shuffling their pieces, trying to find the most effective setups that they can try to utilize. This bishop to f8 move here often combines with the g6 and bishop g7, which would form a very strong position, a nice fianchetto defensive structure for black. This won't happen in this game because white manages very quickly to destroy the pawn structure on the king side. So let's jump to that point. We have bishop g5, knight d7. The rook comes to the c file, points at the queen, so the queen escapes that discovery potential. And here we have the move bishop b1. One of the nice things about these sort of openings is that they're incredibly flexible. White here has a number of different options they can go for depending on the mood that they are in. They can lock up the center with the move d5 here, and after a move like knight e7, they can, consider to trade the rooks, for example. Black will take back, and then simply drop the knight back. And after the bishop is attacked, drop the bishop back. And their point here is I have a closed center, slightly more space. It's a very kind of slow, methodical position, but white holds a very small, healthy advantage. So that's one mindset that you can try to utilize in these sort of positions. White decided to go for a far more tactical approach in this position with the move bishop b1. Their idea is, well, the center is going to open up, and they're getting ready for this by opening up their queen's eye towards that center. And once the center opens up, naturally, the position's going to be far more lucrative. There's going to be more tactics for both sides, and therefore the position becomes very exciting, very tactical, and incredibly sharp. We have knight takes d4 in the center, knight takes, and we have a trade of rooks. Here, bishop takes. The point, instead of queen takes, which perhaps looks more natural, there's a couple of ideas. After queen takes, just positionally speaking, the queen can be a target along the c-file. That's one point. The queen loses its control towards the center. That's a second. And finally, the queen on d1, as you will soon see, serves a very nice tactical purpose. And let's jump to that area. So we have bishop takes, and after pawn takes, a really nice tactic was played here, the move knight h6 check. And the idea is, well, you have the option to take back the pawn in this position. But after you take back the pawn, black's pieces are quite active, and there's a lot of counterplay that black can throw at you. Instead, white decides to really bring the initiative to their side. Knight to h6. The point after pawn takes, which is forced, the move queen to g4 comes. Why the queen, by the way, was so necessary on d1. With a fork, we win back the material, and well, the question here is, why did we do this? Shouldn't we have just taken the extra material? But this is a very materialistic approach. What we've done is we've completely ruined their pawn structure across the entire board, really. And therefore, in an endgame situation, and this game indeed does approach an endgame shortly, white will hold some initiative and some advantage, and we'll discuss that a bit further once we reach the actual moment where the endgame arrives, because for right now, there's still many tactics possible left on the board. So, for example, after queen f5, already setting up one of those possibilities with the move e5, which would set up some dangerous threats along this diagonal towards h7. So in this position, queen f5, we had the move rook to e5. Black could not allow this pawn to advance, so they physically stopped that from being possible by placing a piece on that square. We have queen to f3. I should note, by the way, in all of these positions, the bishop has a level of immunity here. It cannot be captured because then the rook on e1 would hang. So the pawn here is pinned. The bishop is, for now, safe. We have f5. Now, there's a couple of nice approaches here that white could go for that I want to highlight. One of them is queen to d1. This is a really nice option, and the idea is, well, now the bishop is hanging because the rook is defended, but once the bishop moves, well, the idea for us is to trade once, but ultimately take the pawn here on d4, and we continue to set up some threats. The rook is now pinned. This bishop can come in and try to take advantage of that. This pawn is attacked. There's potential for the move f4 as well in these sort of positions. There's some pressure here as well. So this is, I think, a very ambitious way for white to play, where they're trying to again gain some initiative in some play. Instead, white played a second very natural alternative, which is bishop to f4, simply attacking the rook. The rook has to move, and now queen to h5. White trying to again gain some momentum going. There's some pressure now on h6. Something on the king side, white is trying to attack, right? There's some pressure on the king side, certainly with these two bishops, and white is trying to utilize that to their advantage. We have bishop takes e4, we have f3. You can see how the tables certainly reversed here, where suddenly the bishop is now pinned by this rook, and that's one of the key characteristics of a pin, by the way. A pin works in both ways. There is never a case where a pin is solely on one side. Whenever one piece is hanging and weak, there's always potential for the other piece on the other side of the pin to also be weak and hanging. And this move, queen h5, highlights that fact. The bishop now has to return to c6, only move. Now rook c1, targeting the bishop. The bishop comes back to d7, and we have bishop takes h6. We have rook to e6, and very quickly, all of many pieces trade off. The bishops trade off, and then the queens trade off, and we've entered the fun and very exciting endgame that we have here. So one of the things that I want to pose to you before I start analyzing and sort of debunking this endgame, what do you think is going on in this endgame? You can look at the various characteristics of the position. Who do you think is better? Who is playing for a win? What are the various plans that come to mind? So pause the video and certainly take some time to think about this. This, I would say, is maybe the most critical moment of the game. The position completely transformed in the last few moves. Many trades happened, so you want to definitely take a moment and analyze them. So if you're looking purely materialistic in this position, well, okay, white has 5 pawns, black has an extra one, they have 6, I'm counting, and therefore you might think that black is better, but well, chess is definitely not a game that is all about material, and very often it is the quality that counts much more than the quantity, and this position beautifully illustrates that. You can see that white's pawns are very solid. There's 2 nicely defended and nicely compact pawn structures, whereas if we look at black's pawn islands, they have 1 here, 1 here, 1 here, and 1 here. 4 very separated, isolated pawn islands. These 2 pawns are indeed isolated. These ones are stacked. This one is sort of weak. You can imagine if the rook infiltrates along the 6th rank. There are much greater targets in black's position, and that means that although they are temporarily up a pawn, that will likely not stay. And once white regains one of the pawns, the other ones are also very likely to fall, and that's sort of the thing that you see here. So when you're evaluating these sort of positions, do not only count the material. That is quite possibly the biggest mistake you can make. You want to be a lot more holistic in the way that you review these positions, and quality is again far more important. So white tries to do the natural thing, get the king involved. That is often one of the key things that you want to try to do. The rook comes to f7 to defend the bishop. We have king to e2. We have f4, we have rook to a7, now attacking this pawn. Again, the weaknesses here are certainly quite huge. Notice that you can't really defend this pawn. If you go bishop c8, we can even just trade and then take. And once again, the weaknesses of these pawns do mean that white holds a winning advantage here. So instead of this, there was king to f6, white took a pawn, there was a check, the king has to return to f2, bishop to e6, and white takes another pawn. And you can see one falls after the other. This is what is so typical in these sort of positions where one side has an active piece, the other side maybe has some more material, but very weak material. And, very often, these pawns fall super quickly, one after the other. We have rook c7. This was, I think, a very interesting moment as well. If you look at the plans here, you can take this pawn, but then the rook would activate, right? The rook comes back down, it attacks the bishop. A far neater and cleaner plan in this position is to keep this rook as a defensive piece and use the bishop as an attacker. And this is what happens here. Okay, white repeats a little, perhaps for some time purposes, but eventually you see that the rook becomes a defensive piece and the bishop is the aggressive attacker here. And that is likely more effective because the bishop has a bit more flexibility. It can roam around the board very easily. The bishop can take here, come back, and then take here. This rook is really solid. It defends, but it also cuts the king. It serves multiple purposes at once. King d3, the rook moves. We have some more trades, very natural moves by both sides. And I think this is really the key moment in this position. A second question that I have for you guys. Do you take the pawn? That looks like a free pawn to me. Do you take it? So pause the video and once again, think about this question. Should you take this pawn here with your king on f4? The answer is no, because after you take, black can actually draw with this stunning resource, rook to h5. Because after the rook trade, and otherwise you do risk losing the pawn, after the rook trade, this position is drawn. You might be wondering, how is that possible? White is up 2 pawns. It seems that this is not supposed to be a draw. But this is where I think the deep analysis and the very interesting subtleties of this endgame come to light. So I want to take a couple minutes now to talk about this really interesting endgame. One of the key things that you should notice is that one of the pawns for white is an h-pawn, and therefore black has this really annoying resource where they can sacrifice their bishop and leave white with only this h-pawn. The bishop is on the wrong color square. If you know your endgames, you know that you need a dark square bishop in these positions with the h-pawn, and you don't have that here. Therefore, after bishop to b7, and black will come closer, and let's say we go bishop e4 trying to control more squares and slowly build up the attack. Well, this doesn't work because of the move bishop takes f3. A really nice, gorgeous idea. Whatever you take with, still the same situation. The h-pawn endgame with the bishop is a draw. So how could white try to win this position? What makes this position winning if it could ever be winning? Well, it can. If this king is really not active, if the king is on the back rank or really, far behind, and these pawns have the momentum and potential to start getting pushed and rolled down the board, well, then the position could be a different story. So just to illustrate my point, let me suppose that white plays king to g5. Obviously, a terrible move. You give away the pawn. Very bad. But let's suppose that black goes king f7. Again, this is simply to orchestrate a position where I can try to illustrate my point. And here is one. White now has a winning possibility because these pawns are mobile. They can push. And this king is further down the board. It doesn't have the same defensive strength that it does on the 6th rank where it could stop the pawns. Here, these pawns are going to roll down and there's very little black can do. It's too late for black to orchestrate a situation where they could try to sacrifice the pawn for the bishop because that takes too long now. And again, these pawns are quickly going to push down the board. So we can see this in action, h4, h5, f4. Now these endgames are actually still hard to win if black shows the best resistance, but these are winning. And there's a couple of different ways. One of the nice thematic ways that you can do so is to place the bishop on g6 and then bring the king around, and you'll be able to try to set up some attack here. Notice that the move bishop f7 is never a threat. We can simply trade. This is a winning endgame after the very simple h7. So we go back. They won't do this, but now we wrap the king around, something like this. And again, you have to be tricky. You don't want to push. This is actually now going to allow a draw after takes, and king to h7 or h8. What you have to do is instead go bishop f7, sack the bishop temporarily, but after h7, it becomes clear, you win back the material and land in a winning position. So There's still some complications, but the general gist of this position is that if the pawns have the potential to roll down the board, which would really happen if the king is further back, then white can win. So let's see how this applied to the actual game. If we go back to the game, white did not take here because they realized that after this rook trade, again, the king will be able to come in. But what they played instead was bishop to c8, and they declined the rook trades until the king went down. When the king went down to f8, they realized, wait a minute, the variations we just looked at become possible. If the rooks are traded, now this could be a win because the king is again further down, meaning these pawns will have the potential to roll. And keep this in mind, because what happens is that eventually white trades the rooks at the perfect moment, and we reach a very similar position to the one we analyzed. The pawns are rolling down the board, and they're now unstoppable. Again, not as easy as it might seem. There's still some complications, and you can see even Fischer sort of playing around here, trying to find the best and most effective way to convert, but indeed, of course, he does. We reach actually more or less an identical position to what we've seen, where the same plan of bringing the king around will suffice. So hopefully you enjoyed this video. I think it's really instructive on multiple levels. The opening, the middle game was interesting, but this end game, super exciting. You can see, first of all, the idea that quality is far more important than quantity, and also this notion where you should really take these subtleties in the end game as interesting exercises, right? Try to figure out in which positions, and usually that relates to how far away the king is, in which positions do I manage to win these endgames? When should I trade? There's a lot of very nuanced differences that you want to try to figure out. So hopefully this video gave you a little tool to do that. Thank you for watching. Subscribe if you're new around here. Like this video if you learned something new from it, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace out.